So, what would happen if we all stopped mowing our grass? Well, if you ask my neighbors, they would probably say, well, you've already done that, so why ask the question? But overall, what would happen? Um, Anything negative, anything positive? Let's look into it. So, I would dare to say that the first negative would be pests and rodents. It could be mice, rats, it could be snakes, whatever it is that lives in your area that can hide. You'd probably have more of the animal kingdom in your yard. But that necessarily isn't always bad because push come to shove and we were in a grid down collapse. Of course, that's very unlikely, but it can happen and it has happened in various localized regions. You'd have some protein, and some calories there to harvest. Now, what about just what happens to the yard itself? So the yard would reclaim itself. When we mow our grass, we pretty much kill everything besides some of the more stubborn weeds in typically our grass that we like. But all the wildflowers, any kind of other vegetation that could be helpful either to eat or to attract wildlife is usually not able to sustain itself when we mow our grass. But if we allow our grass to come back and our ground to reclaim itself, you'd have a whole host, just like my yard, you have a whole host of options, a lot of edibles. In fact, I can go out in my yard right now and pick enough off the ground to make a salad. Plantain leaves, dandelions, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's typically anywhere from 5 to 10 various plants that I can find within a matter of minutes to put together and get a good handful or two to create some type of snack or a meal or a side item to whatever I'm eating. And I'm not saying I do that a lot, but I have to admit that I do, from time to time, just because there's just free food out in my yard. Same thing goes for if you have nut trees. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with not cutting your grass, but man, I got tons and tons of walnuts and acorns. It's just everywhere. It's just ridiculous. And yes, there's a process to make them more edible. I mean, they're very bitter unless you soak them and get the tannin out. And there's a whole process, and there's different ways you can go about it. But once again, there's just another source of nutrients. So I think that the real big, point to be made here is that mostly when we cut our grass, I think it's just because we want to have some type of pest control. Number one. Number two, it looks good and we get a sense of control over our property. Number three, I think it's a tradition in a lot of areas, at least in America. And I've seen it in other countries that I've visited too, but in America, it's a pretty big, popular tradition to maintain your property, which isn't always a bad thing. Once again, it makes it safer too, but it is somewhat of a tradition. But on the downside, you don't have the density of plant life and animal life that you could if you just let the ground be as it normally would be. Now, in a state of disaster or an emergency that's long term, maybe a grid down or EMP blast, and we're back in the Stone Age for whatever amount of time, we probably won't have the option to mow the grass anyways. So you don't have to worry about that. But at the same time, it's kind of a beneficial thing too, because you increase your chances of, especially depending on how large your yard is. My yard is fairly large. And so, I mean, it's just, you can grow a lot on there. You could do a lot with it. You could just let it reclaim itself and just naturally let things grow. And just the chances of things coming up, at least in my area, a lot of them are edible. And so, you can also use those pieces of ground to attract other animals to harvest. Once again, it could be birds, it could be, ground critters. And so there's a lot to be said about maybe having your yard not always in pristine condition. Now, what about times like now that we have the option? Should you maintain the entire property at all times? That's up to you. I know a lot of people who do, but there's definitely nothing wrong with maybe keeping a small section that is just kind of natural. Just that the ground is just able to be what it's going to be. And that will ensure at least some type of ecosystem. It might be just a micro ecosystem that attracts a few birds, maybe a rabbit or two that can live in that little patch of thicket. But it's just something to have. Where I live, as you can tell, I have all kinds of woods, and there's pretty much everything that lives out here. It's just kind of like the bonus, of having it this way. And it's not just like big stuff like bear and coyote and wolves, but you also have all the little stuff that really isn't so threatening. And I'm not including snakes in that in that comparison, but I'm talking about like rabbits, for example. Rabbits are awesome, squirrels, even like groundhogs, and of course so forth and so forth. A lot of birds, big birds too. And so we have a lot of diversity here. Now, all this diversity couldn't have a home unless there was trees and vegetation, canopies. They have to have a place to live. And so this is very much common sense, but a lot of people, I get comments a lot like, I don't have any animals where I live. Well, maybe you live in the suburbs, or maybe even if you don't, maybe you keep your grass so short, or maybe you trim your trees to the point that not much can live. And so we got to kind of maybe step back and go, okay, what is best for nature sometimes, if you want nature to be invited in and to actually thrive in your location. So hey, just something to think about. Thanks for watching. You guys take care.